Hello poker fans, Navinata on No Limit Hold'em. Today we're going to be tackling that question, how do we make money at poker? Specifically, I'll be answering how we make money. We'll be talking about how we make money playing No Limit Hold'em. I think it's important to first understand, which I'm sure anybody that's taking the time to watch this video at least understands at some level, that once once you have your results and you've tracked them over some period of time, and you know that you are pretty consistently making X big blinds per 100 or X dollars per hour or X buy-ins a day, you also come to realize that you are not really gambling in the traditional sense of the word when you play poker. You are either going to be adding an amount of money to the poker community, or you're going to be subtracting an amount of money from the poker community. Of course, this doesn't take into account rake and tipping of dealers and poker materials like poker training sites and books and other random pieces of poker porn. It's really just the recognition that poker is a zero-sum game, and we're either going to win money or lose money, and the way that we're going to win money is to generate edge. We need to find a way to generate a mathematical advantage against our opponent or opponents, and then take that edge, or the number of edges that we are generating, and run our monies through them until our monies grow or dissipate at whatever level they're going to, at whatever rate, kind of depending on how you want to quantify it. Some of the primary edicts, the things that we need to get our heads around in order to understand where the money comes from and No Limit Hold'em, where it goes to, and how to plug leaks, how to expose leaks, how to make money, how to avoid losing money, how to kind of win the min-max game, is the fundamental theorem of poker, understanding range versus range strategic matchups, and understanding that if I'm playing heads-up poker, heads-up No Limit Hold'em against you, essentially what I'm doing is I'm taking my strategy and I'm running it straight into your strategy, and then our strategies duke it out, and whoever's strategy is better suited, not always, notice I didn't say best, because sometimes poker can be a game about matchups. Sometimes the matchup really makes the makes or breaks hero and villain. That's to say that there are these non-linear hierarchies when it comes to the way one style matches up against another, and it's not until you get two pretty skilled players playing against each other that ceases to be true, and it actually can still be true, just in other ways and in probably lesser degrees. But if a maniac, a maniacal player that plays too many hands, he plays them too wildly, he goes too far with his hands, bets too thinly for value, bluffs too often, if he runs his strategy into the strategy of a payoff wizard, calling station, loose passive fish, the loose passive fish is going to win the money off of the maniac, assuming neither player adjusts their strategy. Not necessarily because he's better than the maniac, but just by the nature of how their ranges are constructed, how their lines are formed, and how their strategies match up. Now, when you get to a certain level, of course, you're going to be trying to beat your opponent's strategy, and you're going to be trying to identify what that strategy is in order to adjust your ranges and your lines and your overall strategy in order to take advantage of the weaknesses that are in your opponent's strategy. And then your opponent, if he's good enough, is going to kind of see you doing that. He's not going to like it because it costs him money, and he's going to try to make adjustments to you, and then you're going to adjust to his adjustments, and then you're going to have these iterations that become the kind of dance that is a heads-up poker match between two relatively skilled players. We've got the principle of reciprocality. I like to say reciprocity because it's a word. I'm not so convinced reciprocality is, but the coined phrase or the principle is coined as the principle of reciprocality, which we'll get into a little bit. We need to think about game theory optimal balance strategies versus exploitative and exploitable strategies and what that means. How can we use balance? How can we use game theory to guide our decisions and to help us make good, clean default lines and strategies? And then what things ought we do to adjust away from GTO or get further from Nash equilibrium play in order to make money from our opponent's distance from Nash. Metagame, this is what we're talking about here. We're talking about the non-linear hierarchies of stylistic matchups between kind of archetypical or archetypal villains, and also the min-max game in general, the avoidance and induction of mistakes, the min-max game, E3 or P cubed, and that just means the three edges. And if you've listened to or watched many of my videos or paid attention to much of what I've done, you'll probably understand what I mean when I say three edges or P cubed. All of this stuff here, all of these things down here are secondary. Like, these are ways in which we do this. Like, what's the goal? The goal is to win money. Well, how do we win money? Oh, that's easy. We generate edges. Well, how do we generate edges? Well, we generate edges by being better than our opponent at poker. Well, what does it mean to be better than our opponent? Well, we could be talking about this, or we could get more into this, but it's really all going to come down to this because we're striving for this. There's levels, and depending on what level we choose to stop and examine no limit hold'em strategy from, the face of it can look a lot different. And I actually think that's one of the difficulties of trying to learn no limit hold'em strategy, and especially for a beginner, I can imagine, anecdotally, I know my experience was like this, where you're not gonna be able to learn everything all at once, and there's sort of a danger in what you might call level confusion if you're not really sticking with one instructor or one coach or one school of thought at least, and you're kind of bouncing all over the place. Well, if Coach A is talking and thinking on the level of the fundamental theorem of poker, and Coach B is talking and thinking more in terms of game theory optimal strategies, or if one player or coach rather is or instructor is doing videos strictly based on game theory optimal balanced type approaches to no limit hold'em, and another is dealing with Bayesian inference and metagame adjustments, and you might hear two very different pieces of information, sometimes contrary pieces of information. Like, one guy might say, well, we want to on this turn, this is going to be a scary turn card for our opponent, and we don't have much of anything here, and we want him to fold, and he's got a bunch of like mediocre hands here, so we want to probably go pretty big with this bluff. And then, like, in the same vein, might be talking about a very similar spot where you're actually betting for value, and you might hear that coach say, or that instructor say, well, our opponent doesn't have a very strong range here, and we've got a very strong hand, and that card's kind of scary, and we're betting for value, and we're targeting certain parts of our opponent's range. We're value targeting this type of hand, so we need to bet a little bit smaller. And if you listen to an equally skilled player explain the exact same spots, they might say something completely different, like, well, we're going to be bluffing here with these hands, and we're going to want to use this sizing with our bluffs. So when we're value betting, we have to stick to the same sizing. You know, two very good players talking about the exact same spot, using different descriptors and actually giving different advice that is actually contradictory, pieces of advice that are mutually exclusive, and that can be confusing. But really, what all of it comes down to, if you're talking about poker skill, you're talking about mistakes, period. Really, the art of poker is the art of avoidance and induction with regard to mistakes. And really, everything else is a stylistic decision, or a choice of how you want to interpret this. Really, what it comes down to is, to be an effective poker player, to win money, you have to make fewer mistakes, or less costly mistakes in total, than whatever player or players that you're playing against. That's, you know, whoever makes the least mistakes wins. That's kind of the nature of the game. And then you could ask two different instructors or coaches this question: what is a mistake? And get two different answers. Again, because we're talking from different perspectives, from different, we're looking at the game sometimes at different levels. You might have one instructor tell you that, you know, when you flat call pocket sixes from the button versus an under the gun open, and you miss the flop comes out like, you know, king seven deuce rainbow, that you just want to check and fold. And another might tell you that you can't check and fold because you're just going to be making too many mistakes. And you know, you might take that little tidbit over to the other coach and say, well, now my other instructor told me that I would be making too many mistakes checking and folding my pocket sixes on a flop of, like, king seven deuce two-tone, or whatever the case. And they can disagree on this. They can say, one of them can say, well, no, that's not a mistake. You took a set line and it didn't pan out. Getting sticky would be the mistake. And the other guy might say, you absolutely are making a mistake here very often, because one player is talking about making a mistake in terms of overall strategy, where the other might be talking about making a mistake in accordance to the fundamental theorem of poker. So if we're looking at it as like an FTOP scenario, or from an FTOP scenario, check folding pocket sixes to a single bet on the flop after a player open raises often will be a mistake, according to the fundamental theorem of poker. But if you look at it from the perspective of his range, your range, how you're going to play future streets, what hands you're going to get to this spot with, and how well your naked pair of sixes is going to play across different runouts, then it may not be a mistake at all to just check and fold. Or it might be a mistake on that street, but not be a mistake overall. From the perspective of some coach who is basically saying that this is a spot where you may as well just check and fold, even though you will be folding the best hand fairly often. You're just never going to be able to get this hand to showdown, because your opponent's either going to be value betting on this flop, or he's going to be bluffing. And if he's bluffing, he's unlikely to just take one stab at it and then let you check your pocket sixes to showdown, and you're unlikely to improve, and pocket sixes don't make a very good bluff, etc. And the other guy might be thinking more along the lines of, if I check and fold here, I am making a mistake on this street. My opponent is betting some percent of the pot that's giving me some price that is better than no price, and so I'm getting pot odds, and I probably have the best hand, so I think I need to check and call here, and at least force him to barrel the turn. And the other guy might think like, well, why do we want to force him to barrel the turn when he is in fact going to barrel the turn, or check the turn back and barrel the river, or have showdown value that's better than your showdown value. So there's different perspectives, and there's different ways to interpret those perspectives. And what one player might call a mistake, another player might not call a mistake. But for the purposes of this video, and in the way that I mean this, I literally am talking about fundamental theorem of poker mistakes. If you could see my cards and do all of the math perfectly, would you fold given the size of the bet I'm making and what my hand, not my range, is? That's what I mean by a mistake. And in these fundamental theorem of poker terms, if you make a mistake, you lose money. It's kind of that simple. I mean, you have to wash it out over the long run before it actually becomes negative or positive earnings or losses. But the mistake has been made, and the fundamental theorem of poker is just that. It is fundamental. It is always correct. And if you could find a way to not make FTOP mistakes on the flop, that would be better. You know, that would be getting you closer to a perfect strategy. The closer you're getting to a perfect strategy, the closer you're getting to erasing all of these fundamental theorem of poker mistakes, like literally by definition. So, you know, which one of these coaches is correct could be up for debate. But in our terms here, so that everything I'm going to say from this point on is consistent, we need to make sure that we're on the same page. When we're talking about mistakes, we're talking about fundamental theorem of poker mistakes. It's fundamental, but it's not that practical to deal with all the time, whereas thinking in more game theory or game theoretical terms is more practically, but it really is just a guide towards reducing the number of FTOP mistakes that you're making, while simultaneously allowing, if not inducing, mistakes from your opponents. Again, just two different levels of strategy. One governing kind of the macrocosmic scale, that'd be game theory, and the fundamental theorem of poker more governs the poker on a like is a microcosm. So moving on, poker is a zero-sum game. The same amount of money is won and lost. Taking out of consideration, you know, tipping and rake and things that we've already discussed. But take all that out of the equation, and poker's a zero-sum game. It's a game of decision making based on incomplete information, and the mistakes that we make are only mistakes if they are fundamental theorem of poker mistakes in this context. We're going to make mistakes. Our mistakes are going to cost money. And what does it mean for a mistake to cost money? Well, if it costs money inside of a zero-sum game, it also means that the exact amount of money that you lost or your cost is going to be somebody else's profit. It's going to be what somebody else wins. That cost, the money that you're paying to make the mistake, doesn't just evaporate. It doesn't just disappear into thin air. It actually is moved into, or it's distributed amongst the other players that are in the hand with you, and it is transmitted, I guess for lack of a better word, clockwise. And if you had like a time-lapse footage of a poker table with all of the chips, and it really like just maybe mapping out the chips, and you took a picture of it from above it, it would look something like that, you know, like a storm. Like if you had like a picture like a Doppler radar setup where you could see the chips moving around, what you would see is the chips moving in a clockwise rotation. And I mean, it would honestly be something you could literally watch. You could watch the chips move from right to left, and you could just see the chips gradually start to build up in the stacks of the players that are making the fewest mistakes, and also the players that are involved in pots where the largest mistakes, most frequent mistakes, are being made. So it's really not enough to not make mistakes. You also have to be involved in hands when your opponents are making mistakes. So when players are making mistakes, you've got to be in the hand. You don't necessarily have to do anything amazing or proactive necessarily, but you have to be involved. You have to be playing a part when a player makes a mistake for their chips to end up in your stack. And I really am trying to, and hopefully this is coming across, I'm trying to break this down in a very kind of abstract way, or really like a hyper-realistic way, but just on a different level than you might be used to thinking about poker, hoping that you can kind of deconstruct poker and kind of, just wash the paint off of the cards and see them for what they are, and take the chips and just break them down into their mathematical construct, like their isness, or their like platonic scale. I might be going a little bit too out there, but it's my YouTube channel, so I'm allowed to go a little crazy from time to time if I want. But honestly, I want you to just take the paint off of the Queen of Clubs. Don't look at it as like a picture of a queen. Don't look at this picture of a jack. And don't see the chips as like these fun things to play with, but just what do they represent? What's going on in the level of mathematics? And what is going on the level of mathematics is players are taking turns making mistakes. And when you skip your turn as often as possible while being involved in the hands where the players are making the most mistakes, then your stack is going to grow by way of your opponent's distance from the Nash equilibrium. So you could think of it like this. Okay, so this little equation I just came up with, so hopefully it's sensical enough. Okay, so H is going to be hero's stack, so H is your chip stack. N is going to be your distance from Nash equilibrium, so it's how far away you are from playing a perfect strategy given the opponents that you're up against. Or you could really just say, you could break it to, or take it to a heads up scenario and just say that N is literally your distance from Nash equilibrium. It's your distance in game space units, if you will. V is going to be the mistakes made by villain or villains, and we can just think of the mistakes in terms of their distance from Nash equilibrium. So like if you're playing a perfect Nash equilibrium, then the distance between your opponent's strategy and yours will be V. So V is the mistakes made by the villain or villains based on or quantified by or thought of in terms of the distance from Nash equilibrium, how far they are away from a perfect game, perfect strategy. S is the number of players, could be one, sharing the equity that the villain or villains are bleeding off. Then HS is hero stack after this, it's kind of arbitrary. You could say this decision point, or this hand, or this session. And then M equals all of these other variables. Like if you're playing in a full ring game, it's going to make a difference if the very worst players are to your right or to your left, or if the very best players are to your right or to your left. Generally, you want the aggressive players to your right and the tight players to your left. You want the either the worst player at the table you want to be on your right-hand side, or the best player at the table you want on your right-hand side. You don't want the best player on your left. You don't want the worst player across the table from you. And if you had to decide between putting the best player to your right or the very worst player to your right, the difference or how you would make that decision should be based on how much better that player is than you, or how much damage he could do to your profitability in the game, in comparison to how bad the fish is. So generally, I think if you have to put one of these two players on your left and the other on your right, you should probably put the fish on your right and the good player on your left, because it's pretty unlikely that it just probably the fish is going to be worser than you are worser than the other strong player. So you can make more money from the fish being on your right than this good player can take from you in profit. or profitability by him being on your left. But I digress. Doesn't really matter. S is the number of players sharing the equity bleed. HS is hero stack after the session, hand, decision point, wherever you choose to make the measurement. And M is going to represent all the difficult variables like the positional considerations, stylistic matchups, just the kind of just difficult things to factor in. Then what you have is this H minus N plus V divided by S times M equals HS. H minus N plus V divided by S times M equals HS. And that is hero minus his mistakes plus the villain's mistakes divided by the distribution and breakup and sharing of those mistakes multiplied by M, which is all this other stuff, equals HS. So really this is probably more complicated than it needs to be, but it's a pretty complex and hopefully illustrative, is that a word? Way of explaining that your mistakes compared to the mistakes of the players that you're playing against, that's what is going to determine your profitability or lack thereof, and that there really is no other thing. So with all of that, just mouthful of having been said, how can we come out on top of this? Like, what do we have to do? Like, what is this all saying? What is it pointing to? Well, fundamentally, we just have to make less mistakes, and we have to be playing with players that are going to make more mistakes. And really, it is just that simple. I mean, there's two paths you can think about taking. You can try to get as good at avoidance and induction with regard to mistakes as you possibly can, or get as good at game selection as you possibly could. And these two things are far from mutually exclusive. In fact, on one level, they sort of do bleed into one another, like a lot of other poker concepts just seem to have a tendency to do. The game, one of the interesting things about no limit hold'em strategy is how interwoven and interconnected and intricately tied together everything is. But this is, one example of that concept, that you could say that you can take path A or path B or some combination of them, but really you can't separate path A from path B if you really think about it, or not with any conviction, because you could say that, just getting really good at no limit hold'em, doing all your studying and working with solvers and doing your homework, do your off-table work, watch the videos, read the books, play with the software, study, and get really good at poker. Or if you could just get really good at conning people into playing that are worse than you. Like if you're the 8th worst player in your home state, you can make a full-time living playing poker if you could somehow get the other 7 players that are worse than you to consistently play with you at high enough stakes you could quit your job, right? But part of the skill, in a sense, becomes game selection. And maybe if you're a live player and you've got kind of a poker community that you're a part of on some level, maybe part of the skill could even be said to be keeping the bad players in your game, or maybe even recruiting new players that suck at poker to play in games that you are also playing in. That could be thought of as part of the skill. So again, that's a spot where it's not just path A or just path B, but these are, they are starkly contrasted from one another, but at the same time, there are kind of like nexus points where they can bleed into one another. I think a very important and eye-opening, potentially light bulb moment or aha moment for me or for you is one that I had when I heard about the principle of reciprocality. Like I said, it ought to be called the principle of reciprocity, I think, but maybe that was already taken. I don't think reciprocality is a word, but this is what it's called, the principle of reciprocality. And it just states that in order to do better than your peer or peers, you must be able and or willing to do something that he, she, them, or they is or are not able and or willing to do. Did you catch all that? Basically, if you're competing with one person, you could just say, in order to get an edge on that person, you have to be able and or willing to do something that that person is not able and or willing to do. To get ahead in life, you have to be able or willing or both in ways that the people that you're competing against are not able and or willing to do. This is exactly true in a zero-sum game. I mean, you can take things like cooperation into account, and you could be in a situation where, you know, the economy's on the uptick and people on average are just doing well. But what I mean is relative to one another, right? So in any zero-sum game or in any situation where there's competition, relative to one another in order to get ahead meaning ahead, not like ahead of yourself or ahead of where everybody was a month ago, but ahead of average or ahead of the person that you're competing against in order to gain an edge, to stay ahead of the curve in any situation in life, and this is 100% true in poker. You have to do stuff that your, let's just say, opponents are not able to do, or they're not willing to do. Maybe two of you at work have the same job, same income, and you're both competing for the one raise. Like maybe there's a management position that comes open, and you and your buddy, coworker, are both trying to get this job. Well, if it turns out that the job is 45 minutes further away, and one of you is willing to make the commute, and the other is not willing to make the commute, well, the person that's willing to do that is going to be the one that's going to get that job. Or if either one of you would be willing to make the commute, but because of other obligations like children, a wife, something like that, only one of you is really able to make the commute, then the person that's able to make the commute gets the job. In poker, it's a lot different than that. You could take basically all of the things you do well, or really all the things you do better than your opponent, and add them together, and then take all the things he does better than you and add them together, and take all of his good stuff and subtract it from your good stuff, and that's going to give you your expectation. It's an awful lot like being on a diet. Thinking of poker this way, I think can be helpful. If you can get past the confusion, it actually becomes clear, more clear, less confusing. Just like being on a diet, once you get past, like if you're trying to cut weight for a jiu-jitsu tournament, for instance, something I can relate to. If you're trying to cut weight for a Brazilian jiu-jitsu tournament, once you get past the fat-free Atkins caveman diet type stuff, and you just realize how your body works, and that if you're in a calorie deficit, you're going to lose weight, and if you're in a calorie surplus, you're going to gain weight. When you realize that you're going to burn X number of calories, so if you take in, let's say X is 3,000, you're going to burn 3,000 calories that day. If you take in 4,000 calories, then you're going to gain 1,000 calories worth of fat. About 3,000 or so is a pound. That's just, it really is that simple. It just is that. Yeah, some things can kind of cheat the system in a way but they're cheating the system by way of increasing metabolism, which burns extra calories. There's nothing else, right? All it is the number of energy units that you burn compared to the number of energy units you take in. If there's a surplus, it's stored as fat. and if there's a deficit, it's burnt off as body fat, and that's it. And the same thing is true of your mistakes and your opponent's mistakes. If overall, in the long run, you make a lot more mistakes than your opponents, then you're going to lose a lot of money to them. If, on the other hand, your opponents make a lot more mistakes than you, then you're going to make a lot of money. Remember, these mistakes that are made cost money. It's a zero-sum game, so if there's a cost, there's a benefactor, right? If one person is losing, another person is gaining that money, but you can't win that money if you're not in the pot. So this is all predicated by first being in the pot. So that's why it's so important. I think one of the most recent light bulbs that I've had go off is really how important it is to be involved with bad players. I know that sounds kind of stupid, but you really can't just play your default ABC strategy if you're playing like a 9-player sit and go. You really can't just play your tight aggressive strategy and wait for the money to come to you when you've got like 5 players that are all really good, yourself, and then just a couple of fish. You've got to get involved with the fish. And I don't want to get back to that level of thinking about the game. I want to stay on this level that we've been at. I don't want level confusion to kind of creep in. But just understand that if these mistakes are not being made, or rather, if you are not in the pots where the mistakes are being made, then the mistakes that are causing this EV to bleed off and be shared amongst the players that are in the pot. If you're not in the pot where the mistakes are being made, then you're not going to be one of the benefactors. And if you take that back out to the macro level, what that means is if you're not getting involved with fish that are going to make mistakes, then you're not going to get your share of that money. I don't want to get out there into the big macroscopic level of actually playing poker, but just for a second we'll poke our heads out of this and say, remember, you don't want to like go so far out of your way that you're making huge math mistakes yourself pre-flop just to go post-flop with fish. You can do that to some degree because you can trade a small mistake to harvest a big mistake later on when the pot grows, but you don't want to play a hand that is like just riddled with reverse implied odds potential and doesn't have the right equity for the pot odds it's getting to enter the pot, because you're not going to be able in all likelihood to recapture that EV that you're losing by making a bad play, a bad decision, a negative EV decision in the first place, like entering a pot with 6-4 offsuit from the small blind because bad player called an early position raise from a competent reg. You're not going to be able to make up for that EV deficit, most likely. I mean, depending on really just how bad the fish is, how good the reg is, how deep the stacks are, how good you are. But I think you get the point. So a lot of this is a matter of perspective. However you want to break it down that way. Hopefully, the idea of this video was to get a little bit deeper than normal and think in a different way and look at things from a different perspective. Kind of like if you want to see what your house really looks like, if you want to kind of look at your living room and the decor of it, the look of it from like the eyes of an outsider, you've been adding things to it a little bit at a time over the years. Look at it from a different perspective. Literally go in a corner and like stand on your head and look at it, and then you kind of get a quick glimpse of what they call in Zen a beginner's mind. You can look at it in its isness. Well, that's what I'm trying to do here, is give you a different perspective and maybe force you to have some kind of like epiphany or at least a light bulb go off. But yeah, it's all a matter of perspective. There really are just 3 edges if you want to look at it that way. Just like there's only 2 reasons to bet if you want to look at it that way. Or you could say there's only 1 reason to bet. You could say you bet when it's profitable to bet. Or you could say you only ever bet in order to fold out your opponent's equity or put more money in a pot that you're a favorite to win. Or you could say, well, you bet for value, you bet as a bluff, and you bet to protect your hand, or whatever. But these are all just levels. They're just different ways of looking at things. And as long as you stay consistent, like don't get level confusion and have it throw a monkey wrench in your game, or more likely a monkey wrench in your ability to talk about poker strategy in deep and meaningful ways with people that are not you and are therefore not necessarily thinking from the same level that you are. So I'm just trying to kind of hit the reset button a little bit. But, if you want to look at it this way, it's fine. I normally look at it this way. It's kind of like the deeper level you get to, the more accurate the information is that you have, but the more cumbersome and difficult it is to work with or talk about or communicate with, or maybe even memorize and bust out and use in game. It's like, I think a good analogy would be, it's easier to talk about things when we're talking about them in Windows terminology than it would be to discuss a YouTube video we saw, but only talk about it in DOS or even binary. Like, you're not going to get very far talking to people about how many ones and zeros there were on some gate. Anyway, pre-flop range construction, position, and post-flop lines, really that's all there is. That's really, if you have really good pre-flop range construction, you're positionally aware, you understand and are able to wield position effectively, and post-flop lines, you have like good crisp post-flop lines. This is what's meant when people say you can only ever go to the flop with one or more of just a maximum 3 edges working to your advantage. Everything comes off of these 3 edges, but you could look at it a different way. But yeah, pre-flop range construction, position, post-flop lines, there's nothing missing here. I don't mean that you could look at it in a way that would make this a false statement, but insofar as it's complete, it's approximate. To whatever degree we simplify, we approximate. Whatever degree we specify, we complicate. And that's just the nature of learning and teaching. So I think the bar is efficiency. We want to, use maximum efficiency. We want to get the right rate of exchange when we know we're trading, complexity for completeness, or simplicity for completeness. But these are your 3 edges: pre-flop, range construction, position, and post-flop lines. And when you get a little bit deeper on these subjects, these also start to bleed into one another. I don't really want to talk too much about this. I think I'm going to wrap this video up, but if you're thinking in terms of pre-flop ranges as an edge, as a way to make money, that means that you're not making mistakes. Well, that means that you're often as pre-flop raiser, you're going to be starting with the best hand, or as pre-flop opener or 3-better or 4-better, you'll have the best hand and be trying to charge your opponent an unfair price to draw against your hand, a price that if he knew what you were holding, he would be unwilling to pay, or you would sometimes like him to fold a hand that he shouldn't fold. And if you can get him to call when he shouldn't or fold when he shouldn't, then that's a mistake he's making, and that becomes negative EV by nature or virtue of being a mistake for him. So it has to be plus EV for whoever else is in the hand with him. And if it's just you and him, then that's your money. Use the best ranges pre-flop to create fold equity. Try to attack the pots, take down the blinds and antes, win whatever money has been V-pipped, but set up good plus EV valuable spots post-flop using domination, synergy, nut potential, and showdown value. There's really not much else to it. It's a lot, it's plenty, but that really is about the all of it. Position, everybody knows, position is king in no limit hold'em, and in a lot of other poker games. The ability to utilize position, though, is itself a skill, right? So again, it's one of these things where if you aren't careful, you can have level confusion throw you off, and you might think that position is somehow quantifiably better or worse than skill. That doesn't really make sense, because part of the skill in poker is understanding what you can and cannot do with position and how to do it. But read this stuff over. These are the edges. This is the way that you can turn your poker knowledge into money, is by utilizing that poker knowledge, putting it into action by way of selecting good ranges pre-flop, having positional awareness, playing a position-based game, playing tighter from under the gun and looser and wider from the button, and all of the fun things that come along with understanding poker. And post-flop line creation, knowing what hands are going to make the best bluff catchers, really knowing how to frame your hands out based on your relative hand value, the texture of the board, your opponent's mistake propensities, what you think their range is, what you know your own range to be, what you think your perceived range is, hand reading, knowing what sizings to use if you're trying to threaten stacks and leverage your stack to put maximum pressure on your opponent over a couple of streets of betting, sizing your betting right, knowing when to keep like a defensive balance strategy going and when to get further away from Nash game space in order to exploit your opponent's distance from Nash equilibrium. Squeezing money out through utilization of all of the poker skills you've built up by watching all of my amazing videos. In conclusion, the fundamental theorem of poker is true and it is absolute, but it is cumbersome, sometimes even to the point of being ineffectual. Game theory is a pragmatic way of looking at the no-limit hold'em game space, or the strategy of no-limit hold'em game space. And what makes the most sense generally is to use game theoretical concepts for the avoidance and inductions with regard to mistakes. We're trading only in mistakes. That's it. That's the only thing there is. Your mistakes are going to be negative EV. Your opponent's mistakes are going to be their negative EV, which necessarily means the positive EV of their opponents. And reciprocity is the key to all of it. It is going to breed efficiency, and again, in one of these weird intricacies and interconnectednesses, you could say that learning about reciprocity helps breed efficiency. Playing efficiently helps you get a reciprocal edge, and that, my friends, is how you win money playing poker.